One thing that I'm seeing from moms all over the country is something like this. My child has done well all year in school. There's been no requests for teacher-parent conferences. There's been no academic concerns. My child is on the AB honor roll sometimes. And then suddenly I get this letter in the mail saying that my child may have to repeat third grade. And it's just out of the blue. So what is going on? So here's what's going on. At least 26 states have passed laws, what they might call third grade retention laws. And so in these laws, the actual language varies and the actual structure of the laws vary. But basically in all of these states, the idea is that if your child fails the third grade reading test, your child will have to be retained or repeat a year. It really varies state by state, the exemptions for that. In other words, how the child may not have to repeat the third grade. For example, in Tennessee, the law states that there just has to be a reading intervention the next year or the summer. In almost every school system in Tennessee, your child just has to take an extra class or get some sort of tutoring. So, at least in the school system I used to work at in East Tennessee, there's very low rates of children actually being retained in the third grade. In South Carolina, on the other hand, this law is fairly new, and the idea is that the child has to retake the test at the end of the year. If the child fails the test again, then that child will be retained. So that's very alarming to parents, that based on one test, your child could have to repeat a grade. In Ohio, the most positive law I've seen is what they call a third grade guarantee, which is where they have a lot of intervention in the front end to prevent this from even happening. And so the idea is to catch your child up and you don't have to deal with this issue. And there's funding involved and there's a structure. So this idea is not really new. There have been high stakes tests used to make educational decisions for a long time. I remember when I was in school in the 1990s, there was a lot of tracking. So in other words, students within the same school were put in different classes based on how they did on standardized tests. That was a pretty normal practice, and it's still a normal practice in a lot of places. There are globally tests that are gatekeeping tests that determine your child's placement. So in many countries, particularly in Asia, you'll take a test usually in the equivalent of about the 5th or 6th grade, and that test will determine what school you can go to, because schools are divided into more of a vocational track and more of an academic track. However, the idea of using tests particularly for retention purposes to make a child repeat a grade is fairly new. The first model for this is in Florida, and that was 2002. And since this, it's just started to be kind of a trend. The idea behind it is good, that children need to learn how to read. And it's based on this idea that at the third grade level, if you don't know how to read well at the third grade, you will not ever catch up to your peers and won't learn how to read well. From a statistical standpoint, that's true. However, from a cognitive standpoint and from a learning standpoint, that doesn't mean that it's totally hopeless after that. So there's this idea out there that something happens in the brain after third grade and it's just so you've got to catch them right then. And there's no evidence of that at all. Adults learn how to read all the time, sometimes even elderly adults. Once they retire, they have time, will learn how to read. It happens all the time. And in some ways, when you're older, it's easier to learn to read in some ways. But we do not put the structure into schools to help students at upper grades to read better. And there's also this idea out there, particularly for middle and upper class parents, that grade retention or repeating a grade is not harmful. You hear that a lot. A child needs an extra time. And the research behind retention is actually very, very negative. So if a child has to repeat a year, it's 50% more likely that they'll drop out. For upper and middle class parents, that's really hard to understand. But if you're in a working class family or a family who has some obstacles to begin with, then another year means another year of going without money, perhaps, because you might need to make money for your family. It means another year of potentially not being able to take care of family members. And I hear things like, well, my child needed more time and my child repeated a grade and now my child's at Harvard. I see these things all the time and people get really defensive about these in the mom post whenever anybody mentions anything about repeating grades. But those families have privileges that other families don't have. And it's not as big a deal to have to spend an extra year. It's a very big deal for these poor working class families. So ultimately, this has just led to a lot of frustration among parents, a lot of confusion, especially with the new states. So what can you do? If you have a child who is at risk of being retained, there are a few things that you can do. So the first thing is you really need to know your state's laws. There is a lot of confusion about this, and you may have to advocate for your child, particularly if you're in one of these states where it's very confusing still. It's a new law. South Carolina, a lot of parents are confused. It's very important that you know the law. You can just look up your state retention law, Google your name of your state, a third grade retention law. It will give you the draft of that bill. And proactively, you may have to make some choices about how you're going to advocate for your child. For example, can you offer to put your child in a tutoring program? That's something some parents can do, some parents can't. But if you have the resources, that may be something that will lead to an exception if you don't want your child to be retained. You can talk to other parents. You can find out what the school offers. You can do all that in advance so that if there is a determination that your child has failed this test and needs to be retained or needs to have an intervention, you know what your options are. So knowledge is power. That's the first thing. Second thing is, you need to keep your child calm. And I know that's easier said than done as a parent. And as a teacher, I know that children get really, really upset about tests. But it's really important that your child keeps calm. And the reason why is the stress and the anxiety of the test will likely make your child do worse. So I've worked in over 20 schools and I was a traveling teacher, and there have been some really interesting things that have happened when kids are stressed out about tests. The most common thing is that kids just get so stressed that they don't do well. They may fail the test just because they're scared. We know that there's like a freeze reaction that's happened sometimes where a child just shuts down and they may not finish the test, or they may just struggle to get through it. In extreme cases, there's been stories about students who have even passed out or throw up because they're just so worried about the test. And that is a real indictment in our society that we do that to children. However, this is where we are right now in the scheme of things. And so you also may want to look into what's called universal accommodations. And that's something that a lot of people don't know about. So when we think about accommodations with tests, we think about students with special needs or English learners. Generally, those students will have accommodations written in their plans that they get extra time. That's the biggie. They get like maybe time and a half, or they get frequent breaks. Sometimes the test is read aloud. But there's also something called universal accommodations. Universal means everyone. So with universal accommodations, these are things that the parent can request or the teachers can do for anyone. And a lot of people don't know that these exist. Typical things in the states that I've worked in are things like small or individual group testing. If you know your child has test anxiety, you can ask that they be put in a small group. The school does not have to honor that, and they may say, well, we don't have the staff, unfortunately. But you could ask for that. And you could even maybe offer your child may be able to get breaks during the test. That's pretty common universal accommodation. So there are things you could do to lessen your child's anxiety. And kind of along with that is that you can help prepare your child. So if you're watching this and your child's in the third grade, there's not a whole lot of time between the tests. There's maybe a month, depending on where you live. Some of the tests are in April and some are in May. But if you are a parent of maybe a second grader going into third grade, you have a full year to help your child. And so prevention is key with this. And so one thing that I suggest is that you look into how you can help your child do better at reading. And I sound like a broken record, but it really is the best way. The best way to help your child in a way that doesn't pull out everybody's hair, that is relatively low cost and doesn't require a lot of extra time, is to get your child to read. Free reading, in other words, the child reading what the child likes, is the best way to acquire vocabulary, to increase what's called stamina, which is the ability to read without getting tired, which is a huge problem in today's TikTok world. It's just very important that your child reads. And even this summer, your child can learn to read better. So there's something called a summer slide, which is where a lot of students go backwards in their reading. And research has shown that that can actually be totally prevented by students reading what they like during the summer. That's all. You don't need to do extra worksheets. You don't need to do graphic organizers. You don't need to ask questions. You don't need to invest in a very expensive app. They just need to read. Some parents have a hard time getting started because it's hard sometimes to find books that your child likes, that your child is able to read, and especially if your child is young. And it's hard sometimes to determine where to get these books. Books are expensive. They are, if you buy from Amazon or somewhere. But I have a course called Reading Reboot, and this course is specifically designed to help parents to engage their children to read better. And it is a course that is only $29.95 right now, and it goes into things like how to find books that your child likes and that your child can read. It's very important that you know your child's reading level. And that's something that a lot of parents are confused about because it's confusing, honestly. But I teach you how to find books that your child likes to read and that your child can read that are in your child's reading level, which may or may not be the grade level. If your child is in the second grade, they may read on a fourth or fifth grade level, or your child may read on a first grade level. It's very common within one class to have really wide ranges. So you need to have books that are appropriate for your child. So I teach you how to find those. I teach you how to create a structure in your home to read. It doesn't take a whole lot of time, just even 15 minutes a day. And so I teach you how to create a structure to read and to motivate your child without a lot of bribery. And I also teach you how to find books that are free or low cost through libraries and through internet sources. So again, this course is only $29.95, and I really encourage it. I think it will help your child to become a better reader, again, in minutes a day. So I'm going to put the link down here if that's something you're interested in, or if you know someone. The course is designed particularly for about 8 and up, which is about second grade and up. And that will help your student hopefully to get a head start and to just do better next year, regardless of the grade they're in, but particularly if your child's a rising third grader. This is a great present, a great investment in your child's future for relatively low cost. So again, I'm putting the link in the description box, and I would love to hear from you. I'd love to hear your experiences with these laws. I know every state's different, and I would love to hear what you think about this as well. So please comment in the description box if you have questions or comments about this topic. And thank you so much for watching, and until next time, keep learning.